The evening sun cast long, lazy shadows across the small, tidy backyard, but inside the little house, a different kind of shadow had taken up residence. It wasn't a shadow made by the lack of light, but one made by the lack of everything else. It was a heavy, quiet thing that sat on the furniture and clung to the air, a weight that only the people living under that roof could truly feel. The man of the house, John, sat at the kitchen table, his large, calloused hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. He stared at a pile of papers on the table, but he wasn't really seeing them. He was seeing the numbers, the big, scary ones that danced behind his eyelids every time he closed them. He had been a construction worker for 15 years, a man who knew how to build things with his hands, how to make them strong and last. But he felt like he was trying to hold back a tidal wave with a shovel. His wife, Anna, moved quietly around the small kitchen, her movements slow and tired like she was walking through water. She was wiping down the counter for the third time that night, a pointless activity she used to keep her hands busy, to keep her mind from wandering to the dark places it always seemed to find these days. She glanced at John's hunched shoulders, at the way the fluorescent kitchen light glinted off the few new gray hairs at his temples, and her heart ached with a familiar, dull pain. They used to talk for hours after their two girls, Mia and Chloe, were in bed. They used to dream about small things, like a new paint color for the living room or a short trip to the beach. Now, their conversations were short and practical, like two generals planning a losing battle. "Did you call the bank again?" she'd ask, her voice barely a whisper. "I left a message," he'd reply, his voice flat, empty of any hope. They were trapped in a loop of holding companies and automated voices, a maze with no exit. Their trouble had a name, a face. It was Chloe, their 6-year-old. She was the sun of their small universe, a little girl with bright, curious eyes and a smile that could light up the gloomiest of rooms. But she was also the source of the storm. Chloe had been born with a tricky heart, a problem that required 3 major surgeries before she was even 5. Each surgery was a miracle, a gift of more time, but each one also came with a price tag that made John's head spin. They had good insurance, or so they thought. But good was a relative term when you were facing bills that looked like phone numbers. The insurance company paid for a lot, but they didn't pay for everything. They didn't pay for the experimental medication that kept Chloe's little heart beating in a steady rhythm. They didn't pay for the weeks of specialized care in a hospital 2 hours away from home. They didn't pay for the little things that added up, the gas for the long drives, the food from the overpriced hospital cafeteria, the lost wages when John or Anna had to miss work. The debt had started as a small hill, a manageable pile of dirt. But with each bill, each late notice, each collection call, it had grown into a mountain. Now they were living in its shadow, and they could barely breathe. Upstairs, the 2 girls were supposed to be asleep. 10-year-old Mia was, but her sleep was restless. She was a smart, sensitive girl who understood far more than her parents gave her credit for. She heard the hushed, worried tones from downstairs. She saw the way her mom's smile never quite reached her eyes anymore. She noticed that her dad hadn't laughed in a very long time. She knew they were in trouble. She had found one of the scary letters once, a bright red final notice sticking out of a kitchen drawer. She didn't understand all the big words, but she understood foreclosure. She had looked it up on the school computer. It meant they could lose their house. The thought was so big and scary, it made her feel sick to her stomach. This house was her whole world. It was where she had learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where she and Chloe had built blanket forts in the living room, where the smell of her mom's apple pie always made everything feel okay. The idea of leaving it was unimaginable. She pulled her covers up to her chin, listening to the familiar, rhythmic beep of Chloe's heart monitor coming from the room next door. It was a sound that had once terrified her, a constant reminder of her sister's fragility. Now it was a strange sort of comfort, a steady beat in a world that felt like it was falling apart. She thought about her parents, about the tired lines etched around their eyes and mouths. She felt a helpless, frustrated anger bubbling up inside her. She was just a kid. What could she do? She couldn't get a job or pay the bills. She couldn't fix Chloe's heart. She couldn't make the scary letters go away. All she could do was watch and listen and worry. The worry was a constant companion, a little gremlin that sat on her shoulder and whispered terrible things in her ear. She started having trouble at school, not with her grades, but with her focus. She would stare out the window, her mind replaying snippets of her parents' conversations, her stomach churning with anxiety. Her teacher had pulled her aside once, asking if everything was all right at home. Mia had just nodded, unable to find the words to explain the giant invisible monster that was eating her family alive. Downstairs, John finally pushed the pile of papers away. He ran his hands over his face, the rasp of his stubble loud in the quiet room. "I don't know what to do, Anna," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion. "I just don't know." Anna stopped wiping the counter and came to stand behind him, resting her hands on his tense shoulders. She didn't say anything. There were no words left. She just stood there, offering her presence, her shared burden. They were a team, but they were a team that was losing, and the loss was breaking them, piece by piece. The house was full of love, but it was a desperate kind of love now, a love that was fueled by fear. Every hug felt a little tighter, every "I love you" a little more urgent, as if they were trying to hold on to each other before they were all swept away. They tried to keep things normal for the girls. They still had movie night on Fridays, with popcorn and candy. But John and Anna would sit on the couch, their bodies rigid, their eyes on the screen, but their minds a million miles away, lost in a world of numbers and deadlines. Mia would sit on the floor, pretending to watch the movie, but really, she was watching her parents, her heart aching for them. Chloe, bless her heart, was still just a little kid. She didn't understand the financial storm raging around her. She just knew that Daddy was always tired and Mommy was always sad. Sometimes she would climb onto John's lap and pat his cheek with her small hand. "Don't be sad, Daddy," she'd say, her voice soft and innocent. And John would hold her, his big body shaking with silent sobs he tried to hide. His heart breaking for a million different reasons. He was failing. He was failing as a provider, as a husband, as a father. The man who could build a house couldn't protect his own. The debt wasn't just about money anymore. It was a living, breathing thing that had poisoned their well. It had stolen their joy, their peace, their future. It was a villain in their story, a faceless, nameless enemy that was winning. And as the night deepened, the little house slept, but none of its inhabitants truly rested. They were all lost in their own nightmares, waiting for the morning to come, waiting for the next battle in a war they were starting to believe they could never win. The shadow in the house had grown so large that it was beginning to block out the light completely, and no one knew how to turn it back on. The meeting with the bank felt less like a discussion and more like a sentencing. John and Anna sat in two stiff chairs across from a man in a suit whose smile never reached his eyes. The office was all glass and chrome, cold and impersonal, a place where numbers were more important than people. The man talked about assets and liabilities, about delinquency and default. He used words that were designed to confuse and intimidate, to make them feel small and powerless. John tried to explain, his voice gruff with emotion. He told the man about Chloe, about the surgeries, about the double shifts he was working. He laid his family's heart bare on the polished surface of the man's desk. The man just nodded, a practiced, sympathetic nod that was completely hollow. "I understand your situation, Mr. and Mrs. Miller," he said, not understanding at all. "But the numbers are the numbers. The bank has a responsibility to its shareholders." They left the bank with a final, devastating piece of paper clutched in John's hand. It was an official notice. Their last chance was a court hearing, a formal mediation where a judge would hear their case and decide their fate. It wasn't a criminal trial, but to John and Anna, it felt worse. It was a judgment on their worth, on their ability to provide for their children. The drive home was silent. Anna stared out the window, the city lights blurring through her tears. John gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He felt a rage so hot and pure it scared him. He wanted to scream, to hit something, to break the cold, unfeeling world that was closing in on his family. But he just drove, his jaw set, swallowing the fire that was burning him up from the inside. When they got home, the house was dark except for a small lamp in the living room. Their court-appointed lawyer, a young man named Kevin, was waiting for them. He was sitting on the edge of the sofa, looking tired and defeated. He had been trying to help them for months, fighting a system that was rigged against people like them. He was a good man, but he was overwhelmed, juggling dozens of similar cases. He looked at the paper in John's hand and sighed. "I was afraid of this," he said, his voice soft. "They're not messing around." They sat in the living room, the three of them, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Kevin laid out the reality of the situation, his words simple and direct, devoid of any false hope. "The bank's legal team is sharp," he explained. "They'll come in with charts and graphs and a very compelling argument about why you're a bad investment. They'll paint you as irresponsible. My job is to humanize you, to show the judge the context. But honestly, it's an uphill battle. The judge sees these cases all day long. You need to be prepared for the worst." The worst. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Anna let out a small, choked sob. John put his arm around her, pulling her close. He felt numb, disconnected from his own body, as if he was watching this happen to someone else. The lawyer stayed for another hour, going over the details of the hearing, telling them what to expect, what to say, and what not to say. But his words were just noise in John's ears. All he could think about was the look on Chloe's face when he told her they had to leave their home. The days that followed were the darkest yet. The house was filled with a thick, suffocating silence. John and Anna moved around each other like ghosts, their interactions limited to the bare necessities. They were both lost in their own private hells, trapped in a loop of fear and despair. John was consumed by a sense of failure. He was the man of the house, the protector. He was supposed to be the strong one, the one who could fix things. But he was powerless. He had worked his whole life, from the time he was a teenager, always doing the right thing. He paid his taxes. He was a good neighbor. He loved his family more than anything. And for what? To lose everything anyway? He started leaving for work before the sun was up and coming home long after it had set. He took every overtime shift he could get, working until his body ached and his mind was foggy with exhaustion. It was a futile effort, he knew. The extra money was a drop in the ocean of their debt, but it was all he knew how to do. It was the only way he could fight back, with his own body, his own labor. Anna's world shrank to the size of their small house. She stopped going to her part-time job at the school, unable to face the sympathetic looks from her colleagues. She spent her days trying to maintain a sense of normalcy for the girls. But it was a performance, and she was a terrible actress. She would make their breakfast and pack their lunches, her hands moving automatically while her mind was a whirlwind of terrifying thoughts. She would find herself standing in the middle of a room, staring at nothing, lost in a memory of a time when things were simple, when their biggest worry was a leaky faucet or a cold that was going around. The shame was the worst part. She felt like they were wearing their failure for everyone to see. She avoided the neighbors, making excuses when they waved to her from across the street. She was sure they all knew that they were all whispering about the Millers and their money troubles. The shame was a poison, seeping into every part of her life, tainting her memories and stealing her future. They tried to shield their daughters from the storm, but it was impossible. The tension in the house was a living thing, a presence that the girls could feel as surely as they could feel the cold floor on their bare feet. Mia, ever the observer, saw everything. She saw the way her dad's shoulders slumped when he thought no one was looking. She saw the way her mom would stare blankly at the television, her mind a million miles away. She heard the hushed, urgent phone calls, the snippets of no other options, and prepare for the worst. One afternoon, she was in her room trying to do her homework when she heard her parents talking in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but the walls were thin. "What will we tell the girls?" Anna asked, her voice trembling. "What will we do? Where will we go?" There was a long pause, and then John's voice, rough with pain. "I don't know. I just don't know." Mia put her head down on her desk and cried. She cried for her parents, for their pain and their fear. She cried for Chloe, who still didn't understand. And she cried for herself, for the childhood that was being stolen from her, piece by piece. The worry that had been a small gremlin on her shoulder had grown into a monster that was now living in her house. She felt a surge of anger, a hot, defiant fire in her belly. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. Her parents were good people. They didn't deserve this. Chloe, in her innocent 6-year-old world, sensed the shift in the atmosphere, but couldn't name it. She just knew that the smiles were gone, and the hugs were tighter, more desperate. She became clingier, following Anna around the house like a small, silent shadow. One evening, she found John sitting on the back porch, his head in his hands. She climbed onto his lap, her small body a fragile weight against his. "Daddy, are you sad?" she asked, her voice soft. John looked at his daughter, at her bright, trusting eyes, and felt a crack form in the wall around his heart. He couldn't lie to her, not anymore. "Yes, sweetie," he said, his voice thick. "Daddy's a little sad right now." Chloe patted his cheek with her small hand. "Don't be sad, Daddy," she said. "I love you." And in that moment, John broke. The wall crumbled, and all the pain, the fear, and the rage he had been holding inside came pouring out. He pulled his daughter close and wept, great racking sobs that shook his entire body. He wasn't just crying for their house or their money. He was crying for his lost sense of self, for the future he had dreamed of for his family, a future that was slipping away like sand through his fingers. Inside, Anna watched them through the kitchen window. Her own tears flowed freely, a release of the pressure that had been building inside her for months. She felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was something else. It was a spark of defiance. They were down, but they weren't out. They still had each other. They still had their love. And as she watched her husband hold their daughter, she knew that no matter what happened in that courtroom, no matter what the judge or the bank decided, they would face it together. They were a family. And that was something no one could take away from them. The night before the hearing, the house was eerily quiet. The girls were in bed. John and Anna sat at the kitchen table, the same table where John had stared at the mountain of bills. But tonight, there were no papers on the table. There was just a pot of tea and 2 mugs. They didn't talk much. There was nothing left to say. They just sat in the quiet darkness, holding hands across the table, drawing strength from each other's presence. They were a team, a small, battered unit, heading into the biggest battle of their lives. They were scared, but they were not alone. And in the face of an impossible situation, that was everything. Upstairs, Mia lay in bed, listening to the silence. She knew tomorrow was the big day, the day that would decide their future. She was still scared, but the anger was still there, burning bright under the surface. She thought about her parents, about their quiet strength, about their love for each other and for her and Chloe. She thought about Chloe's simple, powerful words, "I love you." And in that moment, a quiet resolve began to form in the 10-year-old's mind. She was just a kid. She couldn't pay the bills or fix the legal system, but she had a voice. And maybe, just maybe, her voice mattered. She didn't know how, and she didn't know what she would say. But she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she couldn't just sit there and watch her family be torn apart. She had to do something. The morning of the hearing felt different. The usual frantic energy of a weekday was replaced by a heavy, solemn quiet. The sun was shining, a bright, cheerful disk in a clear blue sky, which felt like a cruel joke to the family getting ready to walk into a storm. No one spoke much. Anna moved around the kitchen, her hands automatically making toast and pouring juice. But her mind was somewhere else, replaying every possible disastrous outcome. John sat at the table, fully dressed, but he looked like he was wearing armor made of lead. He stared at a crack in the plaster wall, his jaw tight, his body rigid. He had the look of a man heading to his own execution. Mia and Chloe sensed the unusual tension and were uncharacteristically well-behaved, eating their breakfast in silence, their small eyes darting between their parents. Before they left, John knelt down in front of his girls. He tried to smile, but it was a grim, stretched-out thing that didn't reach his eyes. "We have to go to a grown-up meeting today," he said, his voice rough. "It might take a while. Kevin is going to pick you up from school and take you to his house for a little bit. We'll come and get you as soon as we're done." Chloe just nodded, her mouth full of toast. She didn't understand, but she trusted her dad. Mia, however, understood perfectly. Her heart started to beat a little faster. This was it, the day. She looked at her dad's face, at the deep lines of worry carved around his mouth. A fierce wave of protectiveness washed over her. She wanted to throw her arms around him and tell him it would be okay, but the words were stuck in her throat. Instead, she just said, "Okay, Daddy, be careful." He ruffled her hair, a gesture so full of love and sadness that it made her chest ache. The drive to the courthouse was silent. Anna clutched her purse in her lap, her knuckles white. John drove with a focused intensity, his eyes fixed on the road, as if by concentrating hard enough, he could steer them away from their destination. The courthouse was a big, imposing stone building that seemed to suck all the warmth out of the air around it. It had huge columns and heavy wooden doors, and it looked like a place where serious, important things happened, a place where a small, struggling family didn't stand a chance. Inside, the air was cool and still. The sound of their footsteps echoed on the polished marble floor. They found their lawyer, Kevin, waiting for them near a set of heavy wooden doors. He looked as tired as they felt. "You ready?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. He led them into the courtroom. The first thing Mia noticed, even from her spot in the hard wooden bench, was how quiet it was. It was a different kind of quiet than their house. Their house was filled with a heavy, sad silence. This was an empty, cold silence, a silence that demanded respect and fear. The room was bigger than she expected, with a high ceiling and dark wood paneling on the walls. At the front, on a raised platform, was a big desk where the judge would sit. Below that were two other tables. Kevin led John and Anna to the one on the left. The one on the right was already occupied. A woman in a sharp, dark suit sat there, her back straight, organizing a stack of papers with quick, efficient movements. She didn't look at them. She acted as if they weren't even in the room. This was the bank's lawyer. Mia watched her, a knot of tightening in her stomach. The woman looked so confident, so in control. She looked like she belonged here in this cold, intimidating room. Mia looked at her own parents. Her dad was sitting with his elbows on the table, his head in his hands. Her mom was staring at her hands, folded in her lap, her lips moving in a silent prayer. They looked small and lost. Mia felt a surge of anger. It wasn't fair. This woman, this stranger, held their future in her hands, and she was just organizing papers. The hearing began. The judge, a man with silver hair and a serious face, walked in, and everyone stood up until he sat down. Then the bank's lawyer stood up and started to talk. Her voice was clear and strong, and it filled the room. She didn't talk about Chloe, or about love, or about family. She talked about numbers. She talked about contracts and payment plans and interest rates. She used big, confusing words that Mia didn't understand, but she understood the tone. It was cold and hard and unforgiving. She made it sound like John and Anna were bad people, people who borrowed money and had no intention of paying it back. She pointed to charts on a screen, colorful graphs that showed lines going up and down, lines that represented their failure. Mia watched her dad's face as the lawyer spoke. He seemed to shrink in his chair, his shoulders slumping further with every word. He was a proud man, a man who worked hard and took care of his own. And here was this woman, painting him as a deadbeat to a room full of strangers. Mia's hands balled into fists in her lap. When it was Kevin's turn, he did his best. He stood up and talked about John's work ethic, about Anna's sacrifices. He tried to explain the medical bills, the circumstances that were beyond their control. But his voice wasn't as strong as the other lawyers. He sounded tired, and his arguments felt weak and flimsy compared to the cold, hard facts the bank had presented. Then the judge asked John to speak. John stood up slowly. He cleared his throat, but when he tried to speak, his voice just cracked. He took a deep breath and tried again. "Your Honor," he started, his voice hoarse, I know we owe this money. I'm not trying to get out of it. I've worked every day of my life. I love my family. I just need more time." He looked down at his hands, unable to say any more. The words were there in his heart, but they were trapped behind a wall of exhaustion and shame. Anna was next. She stood up, but she just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't speak. The pain was too big, too heavy to put into words. Mia watched her mom break, and something inside her broke too. This was it. This was the end. They had fought their hardest, and it wasn't enough. The judge sighed, a sound of weary finality. He shuffled some papers on his desk. He looked like he had seen this story 100 times before, and he knew how it always ended. Given the circumstances and the delinquency of the payments, he began, his voice formal and distant. I see no alternative but to rule in favor of the plaintiff. I am prepared to grant the order for foreclosure. The words hung in the air, sharp and deadly. Foreclosure. The word Mia had looked up on the computer. The word that meant they would lose everything. Anna let out a quiet, strangled gasp. John put his arm around her, his face a mask of utter defeat. Kevin just shook his head, his shoulders slumping. It was over. The judge started to say something else. Something about a recess to finalize the paperwork, but Mia wasn't really listening. A strange calm had settled over her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was joined by something else. A fire. A hot, bright, angry fire. She looked at the judge, a man who held their lives in his hands, but didn't even know their names. She looked at the bank's lawyer, who was already packing her briefcase, her job done. She looked at her parents, broken and beaten. And she thought about Chloe, who was probably at Kevin's house right now, happily playing with his dog, completely unaware that her world was about to be shattered. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. The judge was about to slam his gavel down, the sound that would seal their fate. Is there anything else? He asked, his voice bored and routine. A question he asked out of habit, not because he expected an answer. In the heavy silence that followed, a small, clear voice cut through the tension. Yes. The word was so unexpected, so out of place, that for a second, nobody moved. Then all eyes turned to the source of the sound. Mia had stood up from her seat on the hard wooden bench. Her parents looked at her in horror, their eyes wide with shock and fear. Her mom mouthed her name, a silent, desperate plea for her to sit down. But Mia held her ground. Her legs were shaking, but her back was straight. She wasn't a little girl sitting on a bench anymore. She was a warrior, and this was her battle. She took a breath, filling her lungs with the cold courtroom air. She looked past her parents, past their lawyer, and fixed her eyes directly on the judge. He looked surprised, his stoic expression broken for the first time. In that moment, he wasn't just a judge in a robe. He was a person, and she was going to make him listen. She took another breath, and in a voice that trembled only slightly. A voice that was filled with all the love and fear and anger she had been holding inside for months. She spoke one brave sentence. Asterisk the single word. Yes, hung in the air of the silent courtroom. Fragile, but impossibly strong. It was a voice that didn't belong there. A voice too young, too small for a room filled with such heavy trouble. Every head turned. The bank's lawyer, who had been smoothing her papers into a neat stack, froze. Her hand hovered over her briefcase. Kevin, their tired lawyer, stared, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. But the most profound reactions came from the front row. John and Anna swiveled in their seats, their faces a canvas of pure horror. They saw their daughter, their 10-year-old Mia, standing up beside the hard wooden bench like a soldier answering a roll call. Anna's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. John looked like he'd seen a ghost, his face pale, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear, not for their house, but for their little girl who had just stepped into the path of a speeding train. "Mia, no," Anna whispered, the words a puff of air. "Sit down, honey." But Mia didn't sit down. Her legs felt like they were made of jelly, and her heart was beating a wild, frantic drum solo against her ribs, but she stood her ground. She had rehearsed this moment in her head 1,000 times, but the reality was so much more terrifying. The judge, the man with the silver hair and the serious face, leaned forward in his big chair. His bored, routine expression was gone, replaced by one of sharp, focused surprise. He had seen it all in this courtroom, but he had never seen this. He looked at the little girl, then at her horrified parents, then back at the girl. His voice, when he spoke, was not unkind, but it was firm, the voice of someone in charge. "Young lady, this is a very serious proceeding. You need to sit down." He was about to say something else, to call the bailiff, to restore order, but Mia spoke again before he could. She took a breath, the air feeling thin and sharp in her lungs. She looked past her parents, past their lawyer, and fixed her gaze directly on the judge. She tried to make her voice strong, to make it sound like her mom's voice when she was reading a bedtime story. But it came out small and shaky, barely a whisper at first. She cleared her throat and tried again, and this time, the words came out clearer, filled with a quiet power that stunned everyone into silence. "My daddy works so hard because he's trying to save my sister's life, and this house is the only place she's ever been healthy." The sentence landed in the courtroom like a gentle bomb. It didn't make a loud noise, but it shattered everything. The cold, hard atmosphere cracked. The wall of numbers and contracts and legal jargon that the bank's lawyer had so carefully built around them crumbled into dust. In that single, brave sentence, Mia had done what her father's broken voice and her mother's silent tears could not. She had told the truth. Not the truth about missed payments and interest rates, but the real truth. The human truth. The judge didn't move. He just stared at Mia, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. John and Anna were frozen, caught between the primal urge to snatch their child back to safety and the dawning, shocking realization of what she had just done. Kevin, their lawyer, slowly lowered himself back into his chair, a look of awe on his face. He had spent weeks trying to humanize his clients, and their 10-year-old daughter had just done it in 17 words. The most dramatic change was in the bank's lawyer. The smug, confident mask she had worn all morning had vanished completely. Her face was pale, and for the first time, she looked unsure of herself. She looked at Mia, then at the judge, and she seemed to shrink in her expensive suit. She had come here to fight against a pair of irresponsible debtors. She had not come here to fight a sick little girl and the sister who loved her. The judge finally broke the silence. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on Mia. He gestured a hand not towards the door, but towards her parents. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice much softer now. "About your daughter?" John seemed to snap out of a trance. He looked at the judge, then at Mia, who was still standing, her small chin held high. He felt a wave of pride so powerful it almost knocked the wind out of him, followed by a wave of shame so deep he felt he might drown. He was the father, the protector. He should have been the one to say this, but he hadn't found the words. His little girl had. He found his voice, and it was no longer hoarse with defeat, but thick with emotion. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking. "It's all true." The judge listened. He really listened. He looked from John's tear-streaked face to Anna's, then back to the brave little girl who had changed the entire game. He picked up a pen, but he didn't sign anything. He tapped it on his desk, a slow, thoughtful rhythm. The courtroom was still, the only sound the scratch of the pen and the quiet hum of the lights. The judge looked at the bank's lawyer. "Counsel," he said, his voice once again firm and in command. "Did you have knowledge of these specific medical circumstances?" The lawyer stood up, straightening her suit jacket, a nervous habit. "Your Honor, our records indicate a general medical debt, but the specifics of the child's condition were not part of the default motion." "They are now," the judge said simply. He put the pen down and looked at the file in front of him. He wasn't just looking at numbers anymore. He was seeing the people behind the numbers. He was seeing a father working himself to the bone. He was seeing a mother drowning in worry. He was seeing a little girl who was the reason for it all. And he was seeing her sister. A 10-year-old warrior who was willing to face down a courtroom full of scary adults to save her family. "I am calling a brief recess," the judge announced, standing up. 15 minutes. Walked out of the room, leaving everyone in a state of stunned silence. As soon as he was gone, the dam broke. Anna rushed to Mia and swept her up into a hug so tight Mia could barely breathe. "Oh, my sweet girl," she sobbed into Mia's hair. "What did you do? You were so brave. You were so brave." John was there a second later, wrapping his arms around both of them. He was crying too, big, silent tears of relief and pride, and a love so immense it hurt. He pulled back and looked at his daughter, his face a mess of tears and a wobbly, beautiful smile. "Mia," he said, his voice thick. You are my hero." Mia finally let the tears fall. She had been so strong, but now, wrapped in the safety of her parents' arms, she was just a little girl again. She cried for all the fear she had held inside, for all the worry, and for the overwhelming relief that was washing over her. Kevin came over, a huge grin on his face. "Well," he said, shaking his head in disbelief, "I was going to try a last-ditch appeal based on procedural error. But I think your argument was a little more effective." Across the room, the bank's lawyer was on her phone, her back turned to them, speaking in a low, urgent voice. She looked flustered, her perfect composure gone. The 15 minutes felt like an eternity. When the bailiff announced that the court was back in session, everyone scrambled back to their places. Mia sat between her parents, holding on to their hands for dear life. The judge walked back in and sat down. He didn't look at the file this time. He looked directly at the bank's lawyer. "Counsel," he began, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "This court has a responsibility to uphold the law, but it also has a responsibility to uphold a certain standard of human decency. Pursuing a full foreclosure against a family in these specific extenuating circumstances, particularly when it involves the well-being of a critically ill child, is not something this court will endorse. It would be a public relations nightmare for your client, and more importantly, it would be morally questionable." He paused, letting his words sink in. The lawyer opened her mouth to protest, but the judge held up a hand, silencing her. "Therefore, I am not granting the order for foreclosure. Instead, I am proposing a new repayment plan. All interest on the principal debt will be frozen for a period of 2 years. The monthly payments will be recalculated based on Mr. Miller's current income, to a level that is manageable and allows for the family's essential living expenses and medical needs. At the end of the 2-year period, the case will be reviewed. This is not a suggestion, counsel. This is an order. Do you understand?" The lawyer looked defeated. She had been outmaneuvered not by legal argument, but by a simple, powerful truth. She nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor, we understand, and see that it is done," the judge said, his gavel coming down with a final, decisive rap. The sound was not the one Mia had feared. It was not the sound of an ending. It was the sound of a beginning. As they walked out of the courtroom and into the bright afternoon sun, the world seemed different. The air was warmer, the light was brighter. The weight that had been crushing them for so long, the weight that had lived in their house and sat on their shoulders, felt significantly lighter. It wasn't gone, not completely. The debt was still real, the mountain was still there. But they had been given a path to climb it, a path with guardrails and a place to rest. They had been given a future. John wrapped his arms around his family, pulling them close on the courthouse steps. He looked at Anna, his eyes shining with a light that had been absent for a very long time. He looked at Chloe, who would be waiting for them, blissfully unaware of the battle that had just been fought for her. And then he looked at Mia, his brave, incredible Mia. He didn't say anything. He just smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached all the way to his eyes. And in that smile, Mia knew that everything was going to be okay. Her one brave sentence hadn't just saved their house, it had saved them. The silence in the car on the way home was different from the heavy, suffocating silence of the morning. This was a warm, comfortable, quiet, filled with unspoken words of relief and gratitude. John drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on Anna's knee, a small, constant connection that spoke volumes. Anna kept turning in her seat to look at Mia, who was sandwiched between them, her head leaning against her father's arm. Mia felt tired, but it was a good tired, the kind you feel after running a long race and finally crossing the finish line. She watched the familiar streets of her neighborhood pass by the window, and it was like seeing them for the first time. The cracked sidewalks, the crooked street signs. The overgrown lawns, they weren't just the backdrop to her life anymore. They were the landscape of her world, a world she now knew they wouldn't have to leave. When they pulled into their driveway, Kevin was already there, sitting on the front steps with Chloe, who was showing him a drawing she had made. The sight of their little sister, safe and happy, was the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. As soon as the car stopped, Chloe came running. "Mommy, Daddy," "Kevin, let me have a cookie," she yelled, her voice a happy bubble in the quiet afternoon. John scooped her up into a hug, burying his face in her hair. He held on for a long time, longer than usual. When he finally put her down, Chloe looked at him, her head tilted to the side. "Daddy, why are you crying?" "Are you sad?" John laughed, a real, genuine laugh that seemed to come from the very bottom of his feet. "No, sweet pea," he said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I'm not sad. I'm the happiest daddy in the whole world." Inside the house, the shadow was gone. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, making the dust motes dance in the light like tiny glittering fairies. The air felt lighter, cleaner. It was as if Mia's words had not only changed the judge's mind, but had swept all the darkness and fear out of their home, leaving only the light. They didn't talk much about the court case. They didn't need to. The healing had already begun. John put on some music, an old upbeat rock and roll station, and he and Anna danced in the kitchen while they made a late lunch. It was clumsy and silly, and they bumped into each other and laughed. Sound so pure and joyful that it made Mia's heart swell. Later that afternoon, while Chloe was napping, the three of them sat on the back porch, sharing a pitcher of lemonade. The air was warm, and the scent of freshly cut grass filled the air. It was a perfect, ordinary moment, the kind of moment they hadn't been able to enjoy in years. John looked at Mia, his expression soft and full of a love so deep it was almost overwhelming. "You know, when I was in that courtroom, I felt so small," he said, his voice quiet. "I felt like I had failed you, failed your mom, failed Chloe. I had worked so hard, but it wasn't enough. I didn't have the words to fight for us." He paused, taking a sip of his lemonade. "And then you stood up. And you said the one thing I should have said. You didn't talk about money or contracts. You just told the truth. You reminded them, and you reminded me, what we were really fighting for." Anna reached over and took Mia's hand. "You were so brave, honey," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We were so scared, and you were so strong." Mia looked down at her hands, feeling a little shy. "I was just scared of losing the house," she said. "I was scared of losing all of this." John shook his head. "You didn't just save the house, Mia. You saved us. You reminded us who we are. We're not just a bunch of numbers on a piece of paper. We're a family, and that's the most important thing in the world." The months that followed were not easy, but they were filled with a new sense of hope. The new payment plan was still a stretch, but it was manageable. John didn't have to work double shifts anymore, so he was home more. He started helping Mia with her homework in the evenings, and he even taught Chloe how to ride a bike without training wheels in the driveway. Anna went back to her part-time job at the school, and the smile on her face finally started to reach her eyes again. She started baking again, filling the house with the warm, comforting smell of cookies and pies. The biggest change was in the way they talked to each other. They started dreaming again. Not big, impossible dreams, but small, wonderful ones. A trip to the zoo. A new swing set for the backyard. Painting the living room a bright, sunny yellow. They had movie night on Fridays, and this time, John and Anna were present. Laughing along with the girls, their arms wrapped around each other. Mia felt like she had her parents back. The worry that had been her constant companion for so long had finally packed its bags and left. She started doing better in school, not because the pressure was off, but because she could finally focus. She could focus on her lessons, on her friends, on the simple, beautiful business of being a kid. One evening, about a year after the court hearing, the family was sitting around the dinner table. Chloe was telling a long, complicated story about her day at kindergarten, making everyone laugh. John looked around the table at his family, at the faces he loved more than his own life. He looked at Anna, his partner, his rock. He looked at Chloe, his miracle, his sunshine. And he looked at Mia, his hero, the little girl with the brave heart who had saved them all. He caught Mia's eye from across the table and gave her a small, secret wink. Mia smiled back. She knew that their family wasn't perfect and that they still had challenges ahead. But she also knew that they had something that no bank could ever take away from them. They had each other. And in the warm, loving light of their little home, that was more than enough. It was everything.